The story of the Narzissenkreuz Ordo begins with its namesake, the Narzissenkreuz Institute, an orphanage for both normal orphans and the children of criminals whose parents would be indisposed due to, well, being in jail. The director position would always go to an Oceanid in honor of the Hydro Archon, and the vice director would be a human of exceptional moral quality and ability. It's unknown precisely how long the Narzissenkreuz Institute stood for or when it was established, but over 500 years ago, there was a generation of children there named Basil Elton, Emmanuel Guillotin, Karl Ingold, and Dwight Lasker. They would frequently reenact games with heroes and dragons, but eventually grew up to be adults, all of them becoming, well, responsible members of society. Basil grew up to be an admiral of the Navy and sailed on the flagship called the Sponsian. Emmanuel became a Marechaussee hunter, Karl a reporter, and Dwight the head of the Institute of Natural Philosophy. Eventually, Basil retired from the Navy, returned to the Narzissenkreuz Institute, and became the vice director, serving under then Director Lyris, who was a kind but not particularly intelligent Oceanid. Meanwhile, a man named Eduardo Baker established order in Fleuve-Sonde through less than legal means, shall we say, until the place was raided with the end goal of arresting him. However, he ended up fleeing to Poisson and took refuge with the then mayor of Poisson, Rene de Petrichor. Karl reported on and tried to defuse the tensions between Poisson and the Marechaussee hunters, but negotiations broke down and the hunters attacked in what would later become known as the Siege of Poisson. Eduardo, Renault, and Renault's wife were likely killed, though they may have been arrested instead. Emmanuel, who was among the hunters at the siege, ended up traumatized from what he witnessed and descended into alcoholism. In addition, Eduardo's son Jakob and Renault's son Rene were sent to the Narzissenkreuz Institute. While at the Institute, Rene and Jakob grew close to Alain and Mary-Ann, two siblings who were also members of the orphanage, though why they ended up there is unknown. The four of them frequently played games based around heroes and dragons, just like the previous generation, and Rene played the role of the dragon and Alain the hero. The other two kids were presumably there, but we don't know exactly what they did. At some point, Karl also visited the Institute and took a picture of the four children with Lyris and Basil. The picture would end up in a pocket watch that Alain treasured. Sometime later, the cataclysm arrived, and everything basically fell apart. Elinus showed up in Fontaine, and Basil exited retirement to fight Elinus aboard her ship. Before this, however, she first gifted a feather she frequently wore to Jakob and promised to return. But since she knew this probably wouldn't happen, she also made Karl and Emmanuel promise to take care of the children if she died. They agreed, though Emmanuel only did so under the assumption that Basil would survive. The director, Lyris, went off with the other Oceanids to fight the cataclysm and didn't return. Basil died fighting Elinus, and as a result, and also likely because the Narzissenkreuz Institute was flooded, the institute dissolved. As promised, Emmanuel adopted Alain and Mary-Ann, and Karl did the same for Rene and Jakob. Karl took Rene and Jakob adventuring in Sumeru, since he was quasi-hobby archaeologist, explorer, whatever, where Rene began investigating Conrian records and looking at their world formula and devised one of his own. It's also worth noting that at this point in time, Rene compared the composition of his and Jacob's body to the Gau Carena, which contains Egeria's consciousness, and also noted that Karl's body was different, which may indicate that Karl was not a native Fontanian and therefore not a transformed Oceanid like Rene and Jakob. At this point in time, both Rene and Jakob were very young. Based on Rene's notes about their teeth, Rene is likely around 12 years old, which he calls being an adult, and Jakob is around 8 or 9 years old, which he calls not being an adult. However, during their expedition, they began to run out of rations, and Jakob was in danger of dying. To save his life, Rene secretly used abyssal power to transform Jakob, which bolstered his health and removed the need for food. Rene also began developing his own world formula with Jakob, but their calculations with it predicted an eventual apocalypse. On a side note, it also seems kind of irresponsible of Karl to take these two young children to a desert without enough food, but whatever, it seems to have worked out for them all right, because following their return to Fontaine, Rene began investigating records from Remuria about Fortuna, the cycle of civilizations rising and falling, which tied into his world formula predictions. However, the formula also predicted that no more civilizations would rise after a flood that would end the current one. Rene also researched the seal of chemical marriage, a holdover from the Golden Troop, who lived in the aftermath of Remuria's fall. He devised a theory that consuming Elinus's flesh may increase Jacob's strength, since he had already been enhanced by abyssal power. Although Rene wanted to do more testing first, as was likely advisable, Jacob snuck into Elinus's body without Rene's knowledge and ate some of the flesh. He experienced some minor adverse reactions, but apparently it was just because Elinus tasted terrible, which, to be fair, I would probably vomit too. Back to the Guillotin siblings, Alain ended up joining the Institute of Natural Philosophy, though not before gifting his pocket watch with the picture of the Narzissenkreuz Institute members to Jakob and Rene. Rene. At their meeting, Rene almost spilled the whole predicted apocalypse and Jakob eating Elainis's flesh story to Mary-Ann and Alain, who he had made plans to speak with about the apocalypse, but he held back because they had been adopted by Emmanuel, who was present at the Siege of Poisson and who Rene didn't trust as a result. At the Institute of Natural Philosophy, Alain had an assistant named Carter Scherbius, who had a chronic illness and was also a former member of the Narzissenkreuz Institute from an earlier generation. Alain thought Carter isn't very smart, but tolerates him. Whether or not Carter was actually smart or was just not that smart in comparison to child genius Alain is unknown. Eventually, Rene and Jakob ended up joining the Institute of Natural Philosophy as well. They and the Guillotin siblings ended up becoming close friends with Carter, especially Jakob, who saw Carter as something akin to an older brother. Mary-Ann also ended up becoming a marechaussee hunter herself, though what Jakob and Rene thought of this is unknown. During their time there, Rene and Jakob ended up forming a secret organization called the Narzissenkreuz Ordo within the Institute of Natural Philosophy to combat the apocalypse. Rene also invented the Book of Revealing as a way to show potential members of the Order the eventual future he had foreseen, where primordial being would drink the amniotic fluids of the world dry and create a world where not even sweet flowers can grow, etc., etc. Sound familiar? If you've played Act 5 of the Fontaine Archon Quest, it should. Rene's predictions were of the narwhal slurping up the primordial sea and therefore destroying the world. The apocalypse that Rene foresaw was the same prophecy that all Fontainians would be dissolved, leaving the Hydro Archon, etc., etc. Rene and Jakob planned to prevent the apocalypse by researching more into Jacob's transformation, which Rene had dubbed a neo-human, and helping humanity transcend in a similar method. It's also worth noting that at this point in time, it doesn't seem like the prophecy was common knowledge, though it would become so by the time of the main Archon Quest 500 years later. Meanwhile, in less world-ending drama, Alain successfully invented Numisia Mecha using the annihilation reaction and made a lot of people jealous of him. However, Carter's illness began to get much worse and he was beginning to die. Rene and Jakob took a break from the Ordo to try and save him, but their research into a variety of very different methods still failed. Jakob ended up showing his transformation into an iniquitous Baptist to Carter, who agreed to also eat Elainis's flesh in the hopes of saving his life, like how it had saved Jacob's. However, it failed. Something terrible happens to Carter, his tissues collapse, his organs begin to fail, and Rene preserves him in a living state through some unknown method, but it kind of sucks for Carter, because Carter is apparently in such terrible pain that he is screaming constantly. Rene cuts out his vocal cords to try and stop him from screaming. It doesn't work. The vocal cords grow back. Let's all take a moment to appreciate precisely how rational Rene is acting. Alain breaks ties with Rene and Jakob over the Carter incident. Honestly, I would too, because wow, you transformed him and now he's stuck in a state where he's alive but can't die and is in constant pain, and you tried to cut out his vocal cords. In lighter news, at some point Alain also made an intelligent mechanical dog named Seymour to help Mary-Ann with his job. Potentially related to the Carter thing, but also maybe not related to the Carter thing, Alain ended up leaving the Institute of Natural Philosophy and joining the marechaussee hunters with Mary-Ann. Despite Alain leaving and their failure with Carter, Rene and Jakob and the Ordo kept researching the apocalypse. However, since Carter failed to experience a similar transformation to Jakob and instead ended up in, well, Rene turned towards researching Remuria's attempts to combat the fall of their own civilization, which they had planned to do by placing human minds into immortal golems. Mary-Ann, meanwhile, ended up finding Lyris in the flooded ruins of the Narzissenkreuz Institute. Lyris, as previously mentioned, was not very intelligent and didn't understand why all the children of the Institute had disappeared. Mary-Ann told Jakob and Rene, and presumably Alain, about Lyris as well. Rene and Jakob went to visit Lyris at some point, at which point Jakob gave her Basil's feather. Mary-Ann would also return frequently and spend time with Lyris. The two of them wrote a story together featuring the final generation of Narzissenkreuz Institute kids on an adventure in the Narzissenkreuz Adventure Team. The Ordo began construction of the Tower of Gestalt on the location of the primary seal of chemical marriage. In addition, they discovered what seems to be the slates from the Remurian ruins in Act 5 of the Archon Quest that depict the prophecy that all Fontainians will be dissolved, which supported the ward formula. It is possible but unconfirmed that the Ordo were the ones to take and hide the first slate of the prophecy, which depicted Egeria creating Fontainians from humans. Based on their research of Remuria, Rene and Jakob ended up developing a plan to use primordial seawater to absorb everyone into one greater will, combat the apocalypse, and then keep everyone's wills and souls around as the greater being in the new world following the flood. Whether or not everyone would turn into one giant hive mind or retain some individuality is some unknown, but Jakob does say stuff about reuniting with people in the new world, so it seems to be implied that people would still have some measure of, self. For this purpose, they ended up recruiting Lyris to their side and bringing her to the tower, though this was also because they wanted to help her, not just for her powers, but that was very useful as well, because using Lyris' Oceanid powers and the Holy Blade of Narzissenkreuz, an object imbued with human reason, Rene separated his will from his body in the hopes of becoming a being akin to a descender, one with a will that can rival the world. The plan following this was to reverse the seal of chemical marriage, unleashing the primordial sea upon Fontaine, which Rene would control using the Holy Blade to absorb all human will and transcend physical form, thus saving everybody and preventing the apocalypse. However, it failed. Jakob preserved Rene through some unknown method and began working on ways to revive him. Anne stopped by at some point and questioned Jakob about Rene. Jakob did not want to tell her the truth, namely Rene is like half dead, but also didn't want to lie because childhood friends, so Mary-Ann ended up departing without any answers. In the meantime, Jakob told the members of the Ordo that Rene was maintaining separation from the world or some other fancy esotericism thing that was very untrue because he had no qualms about lying to them. However, the Ordo started getting suspicious despite Jakob's lies, so Jakob dissolved the members who were getting suspicious as part of his experiments. He was unable to create a stable being even from this conglomeration of wills, but it did advance his research. He ended up successfully creating a being known as Narzissenkreuz, aka the Master, in the end by combining Rene's will, Lyris' powers, Carter's remains, and the pocket watch received years ago from Alain. What was the purpose of that one? Not really sure, but it was in there as well. Narzissenkreuz did not consider himself Rene, but he was unaware of the fact that there were multiple failed attempts to create him, which Jakob kept a secret. After Narzissenkreuz's creation, the rest of Carter's remains were also grafted onto a hilichurl, who was named Caterpillar but did not possess any of Carter's memories. To help Narzissenkreuz become a being whose will could rival the world, several members of the Ordo underwent a ritual using Lyris' powers and the Holy Blade that separated their wills and egos from them and incorporated them into Narzissenkreuz. They were apparently pretty much the same afterwards, according to Caterpillar, so what exactly they lost in this exchange is kind of unknown, but that was the purpose. However, Narzissenkreuz also had the ability to dissolve people against their will, which he used on several Marechaussee hunters, including Emmanuel Guillotin and champion duelist Marfisa, to absorb their memories, and discovered that the hunters were aware of the Ordo's existence. Potentially because of the attacks on the hunters, but maybe because of something else, Alain and Mary-Ann ended up declaring the Ordo a terrorist organization. It all ended up culminating in a huge fight inside of Elenus' body. Narzissenkreuz sent the Ordo to buy him time in the fight while he worked on something unknown, not really sure what he needed the time for, but as a result of the fight, Seymour was damaged and Lyris fused with Mary-Ann, presumably to save Mary-Ann's life. Potentially inside of Elenus, but potentially also at a different location, Narzissenkreuz and Alain fought, which ended with Narzissenkreuz falling into the primordial sea. In the aftermath, the Lyris-Ann fusion was confused and went back to the ruins of the Narzissenkreuz Institute, which would become known as Anaposis, to live out a dream inside of the story they had written together previously, where all the members of the Institute were alive and happy and adventuring together. The hero of the story was the Oceanid Ann, a version of the Lyris-Ann fusion, which she accidentally created, though Ann did not possess any of Lyris-Ann's memories outside of the story. Melusines also began to be born from wounds inside Elenus with their little mechanical pieces, and Alain was depressed and founded the Institute of Kinetic Engineering. Before his death, he also created some unknown last creation and then disappeared. Down in the primordial sea, Narzissenkreuz fought to keep his will together, planning to eventually turn to Dwight and enact the original plan. And everything else is basically just a prelude to the Narzissenkreuz Ordo World Quest. Jakob chills for 500 years, except for buying some of Mimir's paintings. Caterpillar ends up in the fortress of Meropide. Seymour is recovered by Mimir, etc. You know the rest. On one final side note, the pocket watch's whereabouts during these 500 years is a massive mystery. It was used to create Narzissenkreuz, and according to the artifact description, it fell into the primordial sea with him. So it's not like it wasn't part of his body. However, when Jakob goes around unlocking the orphans storing in the Wake of Narcissus, he's in possession of the pocket watch. So how did Jakob get his hands on it? No idea. Don't ask too many questions, guys. That has its own laws. Also, because I have been emotionally devastated by the Narzissenkreuz lore, I would like to point out that, even to the end, Rene and Jakob wanted to save Alain and Mary-Ann, and the Carter incident seemed to haunt them to modern day, considering they accidentally imbued a copy of Carter's memories and flesh or spirit within the Book of Revealing, and Jakob spoke very disparagingly about Caterpillar's failure to transcend from a hilichurl into presumably actual Carter. They're both very emotional people, actually, despite lots of talk about transcending useless human personality and will. Rene and Jakob are both mass murderers, but they were also tiny children when the whole thing started. Mates, let this be a lesson to you about not letting small children wander off unsupervised and eat the flesh of strange abyssal beings, or else they'll grow up to try and prevent the apocalypse through lots of murder. Also, don't let your adopted children almost starve to death. Karl Ingold was not cut out to be a parent. Basil, bad decisions. Just because they're your childhood friends doesn't mean they will make good parents. But in the end, that's what happened. And we don't actually know what happened to Karl in the end. But Emmanuel died. Basil also died. Dwight, who knows? Thanks for listening. If you like this, please like and subscribe. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Thanks, and have a great day.